I'm Chris McDonough, a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room. Welcome to the interview room, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this wonderful Sunday evening. Boy, have we got a show for you tonight. And as always, right up front, everybody is innocent till proven guilty in the court of law. And be mindful and respectful of everybody in the chat. We're so grateful to each and every one of our mods who spend their time, Miss Sophia, Maui Girl, Teresa M, and Mimi J2, to keep the chat clean and classy and high above the waterline. Wow. Well, we've reassembled the panel, as you can tell, with a added special edition. So we'd like to welcome everybody. If you're new to our channel, we only ask one thing, and that is just hit that subscribe button and that like, and give it a thumbs up and send it to your friends and your family and anybody else you can think of. Want to welcome all of our new Patreon members: Sandy, Lanai, Susan, Jen, Misty, Aaron, Catherine, Margaret, and Heather. Thank you for joining us and for being a member of the TIR family, as well as any of our new subscribers. Well, here we go tonight. A quick rundown on everybody that's on the panel tonight. Of course, everybody knows Dr. Ann Burgess. Ann is a renowned pioneer in the assessment and treatment of victims of trauma and abuse. She is a professor of psychiatric mental health nursing at Boston College Cornell School of Nursing, and she's a professor emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania, and is one of the original Mindhunters. Her work with the Behavior Science Unit at the FBI Academy is featured in the Netflix series Mindhunter, where the fictional character Dr. Wendy Carr is based on Ann's work and professional career. And Ann is much better looking as well than this actress who played her. I have to be honest with that. She's a legend in the behavior science world, and she has won many awards and accolades throughout her career. She was also named a living legend by the American Academy of Nursing in 2016. And next, over in the upper left-hand corner for 100 in Hollywood Squares is Dr. Gary Brucato. Gary is a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he collaborated with Dr. Ann Burgess and Victor Petreka, Dr. Petreka, on forensic research. They have examined crimes such as murder, including serial murder, serial killing, sexual offenses, mutilation, and cutting somebody apart as the insanity defense. Okay. Gary is currently a consultant on a grant-funded project by Ann and Victor analyzing murders involving asphyxiation by strangulation and other means. He studies how violent thoughts and actions emerge in psychotic versus non-psychotic persons. Wow. Gary is also a legend in the lanes that he runs in here among his colleagues. He is the co-author of the Columbia University Mass Murder Database, and he's also the co-author of a book called The New Evil: Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crimes. And I also forgot to mention that Ann is also an author of many books, many books, and you will find them all in our links below, and you'll also see them on the thumbnail that I provided for the show tonight. And the upper right-hand corner for 150 is my dear friend, Greg Cooper. We've been friends for many years. Retired FBI profiler. He ran the behavior science unit as the acting chief. He was a FBI National Academy instructor and in criminal psychology, criminal investigative analysis, and analytical aspects of criminal behavior. He is the co-author. He co-authored the Crime Classification Manual and landmark book on homicide, arson, and SA, or sexual assault. Greg's work as an expert witness in crime scene analysis was highlighted in the New York Times bestseller Mindhunter, along with Anne, inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit. He's the founder and executive of the Cold Case Foundation, which I am a proud member of, and it's just great to have Greg back here with us tonight. And in the bottom left, for another 150 is Dean Jackson, my dear friend. And Dean is the deputy executive director of Cold Case Foundation. He's an accredited instructor for the International Critical Incident Stress Foundations. He's an author of Death Notification, Delivering Offensive Messages in the Least Offensive Manner. He is a soul that is deep in thought, and as you guys get to know him even more and more, you, like me, will recognize why he trains law enforcement across the world and government agencies on stress management, death notification, and of course, relationships within those industries. And of course, our special guest tonight, Miss Kerri Rawson. Kerri is the best-selling author of A Serial Killer's Daughter, My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming. She is the biological daughter of Dennis Rader, known as the serial BTK, and she's an advocate for trauma, crime, and abuse victims. And she's also the proud mom of 2 children and 2 cute little kitties named, Kerri, what are their names?
Jack and Nick.
Jack and Nick. Okay. It's great to have each and every one of you here tonight. I need to do 30 seconds here and ask my sweetheart to grab my phone and plug it in because it's losing power. So we're going to have to, while she's behind me, grabbing my phone, which is my Wi-Fi hotspot. You got to, okay, I'm going to turn off my camera, she said. So 30 seconds, and you got to put the shade up. Okay. Okay, give me 30 seconds here. Hang on. We're going to do a little modifications. This is the advantage of being able to go anywhere in the country in an Airstream and have your hotspot with you and run out of juice just as the show is starting. So, welcome to modern technology. And you can hear the screen going up. Okay, I'm back. It'll stop in 30 seconds. And of course, our audience is absolutely the best. They get it. They absolutely get it. Okay, guys, big day here. Big day. I first want to point out, wow. Gary, Ann, Greg, everybody, Dean, Kerri, you nailed it. You nailed this before he was captured. And the initial assessments that were discussed on this program long before anybody knew the name of Bryan Kohberger were right on absolute target. And, touche. What we've learned is he was outside of those residences at least 12 separate times, months and months before the homicides went down. A couple interesting things. There was a sheath left behind, which is obviously they're connecting him through DNA, touch DNA at this point. But there doesn't appear to be any interpersonal style and unusual essay qualities to these particular problems. And so the first question tonight is, unfortunately, mass murder is not an uncommon problem here in the United States. And Gary, you said, and you mentioned it right from the get-go, this guy would be a mass murderer. Okay? And evident of the fact that last night, today, we all woke up and 10 innocent lives were taken in LA in another mass murder event, and 10 others were injured, and some of those may or may not make it. Okay? But however, in this situation, it appears to be getting unusual attention, not only inside and outside of the country. But what makes these types of crimes, and or at least this particular incident, so appealing to people? What do you think? And Dr. Brucato, we're going to start with you first tonight, and then Ann, and then we'll go to Greg. And what do you think? What makes it so appealing?
Well, if you mean the public interest in mass murder generally, it's quite a different answer than if you mean the Bryan Kohberger case. I understand the interest in mass murder generally because despite the fact that one is very unlikely to be killed in a mass murder incident, they are so disproportionately disturbing and upsetting and random when they're reported in the news that we all become quite afraid. If you step back and look at the statistical likelihood of being involved in a mass murder event, it's quite low. But there is that feeling of them being increasing, and it could happen anywhere. So I think there is a kind of a self-protective reason even why we're kind of drawn to paying attention to those cases. The Kohberger case is extraordinary in terms of the attention that surrounds it. I can't help but believe that part of the reason for this is almost diagnostic of the personality structure of the individual involved. I feel that when a person is particularly ego-driven, the world around them divides up into people who, are talking about them to various degrees and in various ways and sticking them on the front cover of the newspaper every day. And I can't help but feel that this is exactly what the offender intended. As a sort of sad substitute for some feelings of smallness or something. But I think it has something to do with being drawn in because we're supposed to be. On a more superficial level, I think it has to do with the idea that it's totally scary crime. It involves people that I think for a lot of people out in the country kind of remind them, of people they know, remind them of themselves. They were killed in a totally vulnerable position of being in their beds. I don't know anything that's much more terrifying than that construct of like laying in bed and having somebody break in and I think, but I can't help but feel we should think a little bit about why with this particular person we're so caught up. I think it's a little related to his personality.
Okay, Dr. Burgess?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting today, or actually last night, that it almost is an opposite type of mass shooting or mass killing. It was outdoors compared to Kohberger, which was inside, and it was during a celebration. They were supposed to be celebrating some ceremony. It was what was similar, of course, it was the same racial group. This was an Asian group, as I understand it. But we didn't see any photos of the victims, so we don't know too much about that. At least here in Boston, I haven't seen anything come out on that. But so why are people so interested? Well, I think one of the reasons is people identify with the victims. They don't identify, hopefully, with the offender, but with the victims, and they're thinking, what if that were me, or how would that be? And so I think they follow it. It was almost word by word. You could go on, and before they realized that the shooter was dead, that there was a lot of intrigue around that. So I think that's one of the reasons that people tune in and follow it, is because of the identification factor. And what would they do if they were in the same kind of a situation? Because everybody goes to celebrations. I mean, that's not an uncommon situation. But similar in Kohberger case, everybody goes to sleep every night. So you'd certainly have some parallels, if you will, if not some major differences. And I think that's what keeps people very much tuned to it. The other factor is, as people are watching, they're also thinking, how can I avoid it? What if I was in a situation? What can I learn? And I think that's why we try to talk about it, is what can people learn from this to be able to protect themselves and to keep as much of the victimization down as possible.
Hey, Greg?
Wow, can I add much to that? Let me just highlight or emphasize that Anne has been a mentor of mine since 1991. That's been a while ago. And Gary now is a new mentor who's come on board, as has Anne, onto the Cold Case Foundation. And so, listening to them both is such a highlight. I've been in the business for a long time, but I think the fascinating thing about it is I know that the older I get, the less I think I know. I become more familiar with things, but then I learn constantly from people like Ann and Gary, and those that we have the privilege of rubbing shoulders with. That even includes you, Chris. You've got a lot under your belt in terms of years of experience and numerous homicide investigations that is unparalleled, certainly in the classroom. And what an opportunity it is for all of us to be able to get together and learn from each other. Just to reiterate what's already been said, probably, I think the fascination comes from the fact that as we look at the victimology and so many of these, what we might refer to as typical mass killings, is the vulnerability that all of us have, that any one of us could become a victim of a mass killing, because typically they take place in a public setting or semi-public, say within a workplace. And as the example from last night, a public setting, and that we can name numerous examples that way. Semi-public may be the workplace, but also of domestic homicides. We see that. And any one of us at any time could be associated with that kind of environment, situation, and circumstances. So it really highlights the fact that we are all vulnerable. So what can we do to prevent from becoming a victim of that type of a crime within that kind of a construct? So I think that's on everybody's mind. And that's probably, from our perspective as a foundation, trying to find the lessons learned so that we can share those lessons with the public to help reduce the risk level, anyway, to maintain a low risk level of becoming a victim of that kind of a crime, while recognizing that there is only so much we can do. And if at any time somebody targets a particular group or a group of individuals or an individual, we're somewhat limited and restricted in terms of what we can do to try to avoid that. But I think as we review these cases, the good thing about it is there are lessons to be learned, and that we can share those with the public. And that's part of our purpose this evening. So I think the vulnerability and the commonality, and as both have mentioned, particularly vulnerable, you're sleeping at night in your own home or your own residence, not doing anything wrong. You're not out there in the public somewhere in an exposed or risky activity. You're at home in bed. That particularly is very dramatic and disturbing for all of us. And it does highlight some aspects with respect to security measures that can be taken of our residences and where we reside, and what can be done to influence perception on the outside of that residence, as well as the internal security measures that can be taken to prevent such atrocities.
Okay, so Kerri, I'm going to come to you for a second because you come from such a position of authenticity from the other side, not only being a survivor, but you have a double whammy here. You're as much as a victim with the circumstances that you were thrust into, not by choice. But I'm curious as to what you feel, if you're seeing any correlation in the behaviors that we're learning about in this Bryan's development, and if there's any correlations from your personal experience of things that you're looking back now are going, that looks familiar. And so if you'll kind of touch on that, and then Gary and Dean, if we can kind of go into, the development of a mass murderer, okay, versus a serial right now. Okay. But Kerri, what do you think?
Well, first, going back to your other question, I, being a little younger here, kind of live on social media. And it was shocking how much involvement was going on in the general public with the Idaho case from the get-go. There's just a massive surge of true crime coverage. These internet sleuth groups, there's ethics questions arising in these places. I actually almost likened it to a live ongoing murder mystery going on for the last few months, but you're talking about real people for young people that lost their lives. And I think sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle. Just going back to what you were saying before, in regards to Kohberger and my dad. So my dad was 28 when he committed his first murders. It was part of the Otero family in January of 1974. So my father went from breaking and entering, stalking, what he called trolling for victims, simple burglary of lingerie and stuff. So he went from that to an attempted kidnapping. He reported them in the fall of 1973, straight into what was his first murders. Now he's a serial killer because he committed 6 more murders after that, 7 scenes in total. But if he had been caught after his first one, we would call him a mass murderer. So one of my questions tonight for the panel when we get there is, was Kohberger a budding serial killer? We have to call him a mass murderer because he's been caught. But I don't believe he would have been stopped. I believe we were looking at a serial killer. I don't know if we're allowed to use that term here. I mean, we can't, but if he had continued. Also, with my father, then being the same age, entering in a house with multiple people, my father actually didn't even expect the adult male to be home when he did enter in 1974. So he got into a situation he was not fully prepared for, and he had to call it what he calls improvising. I believe Kohberger maybe didn't know how many people were in the house. In my opinion, I believe he was maybe targeting the young women on the 3rd floor, ran into people awake on the 2nd floor. My father wouldn't have left anybody alive if he could have. He did have one person that survived his second one in 1974, but that was not intentional. So my question is, was Kohberger aware there were 2 surviving women in that house? And how did he feel when he found that out after it became news? The differences between them, my father is a strangler. So there was only one stabbing in 1974, and that's only because he had to finish it quickly in his own words, and he didn't like it. So there was a big difference there in my father's MO and Kohberger's choice of weapons. And my father doesn't like blood. I would assume Kohberger's highly attracted to it. So there's a big difference there. Another important thing about my father is he was a criminology student. So he studied criminal justice at Wichita State. He literally went into classes right around the same time he committed his first murders. Then he had access to means and methods, getting to talk to law enforcement while they were working the BTK cases. So he murdered 7 people in the 70s while studying his own crimes in classes and enjoying that and basically making fun of them and mocking them in his head while they were sitting there trying to figure out who this murderer is, while wearing possibly Mr. Otero's watch. My father stole trinkets and mementos. So he was walking around with wearing Otero's watch, possibly seen at the second murder. So that's another question I have. Did the law enforcement find anything in Kohberger's apartment, mementos? I would assume possibly, but we're going to have to see.
Awesome. Who wants to take her first question? Because is a very deep thought in relationship to her dad's correlating behavior. And what structure the question one more time for me, Kerri? I'm sorry.
Well, I guess there's a few questions there. I threw them out there. One is, would Kohberger be considered, do you think Kohberger would have been capable of more murders? Did we have a budding serial killer on our hands? And then to address, like, it is possible for somebody to have their first murder before, a lot of people are saying, no, there must have been others. And then just maybe comparing the MO here and the choice of weapon. Okay,
so we'll start with Ann. She studied the serial side of this, and then Gary, if you'll weigh in, and Greg, we'll go in that order right now. And you're muted, and that's my bad.
Sorry. The issue of has he killed before or will he kill again? That keeps coming up. That is something that a lot of people seem very, very focused on. And of course, it could be because nobody knows the answer right now, except Kohberger, as far as we know, or hopefully we would have had some information that pointed to that. So for some reason, that seems to make a big difference to people. I'm not sure why. I think that once that somebody has murdered as he is alleged to have murdered, he's crossed the line. So that the more that happens, the easier it is, if you will, is what we certainly have found with other serial killers, or what they have said. I remember Monty Russell was a very good example of how he got into killing, and then that was it. He just kept killing. So from that, I would answer that there's no question in my mind he would have kept killing if he wasn't caught. So that's always the reason why you try to catch these people. Whether he had killed before is not clear. We had said initially, if I remember, I know what I said, and I think most of the panel agreed that if he killed, it had been animals and not necessarily people. I don't think any of us felt that he had killed before, but I'm happy to just sit with that myself. I may be wrong, but I don't think he did. He certainly had a lot of time planning and so forth, and for all the planning that he did, he certainly still made a lot of errors, thankfully.
Okay. Gary? Thank you, Dr. Burgess.
Well, so first of all, as I had mentioned on the previous program, when we did the Columbia Mass Murder Database, we found that 11.78% of mass murderers had either killed previously with a cooling off period or went on to kill again. So they were serial killers by definition. When you look at the remainder of the people in the database and you remove people who kill because of organized crime or gang activity, in other words, state-sponsored terrorism, we are isolating to personal cause mass murders. What you realize distinguishes these people from serial killers really is the following. It is not really, how shall we say this? They usually have an immediate cause. Something has happened recently that disintegrated their sense of purpose or identity, like losing a job or losing a significant other or losing a scholarship or getting thrown out of school or something like that. And what you have is people who, in general terms, when we look at the statistics, sort of lack coping skills and kind of emote. And their personality can be blended in there because some of them can plot and scheme and do so over some weeks or months, before they go in and commit a mass murder. But and there could be real nastiness in how they do it, or there could be a lot of narcissism and wanting a lot of attention and doing it, or sour grapes about other people who have what they don't have. So there's this kind of immediacy, and there's a tendency to think that these people are probably quote unquote crazy or mentally ill. When we went in and looked at it, what the statistics suggest is that mass murderers who use firearms are far less likely to have any degree of serious mental illness. They're usually pretty personality disordered people, or people who lack coping skills. And when you get over into people who use any other method, like knives, it's statistically far more likely that they have serious mental illness, like some history of some psychotic symptoms or severe peculiar ideas that can be, and there can be an overlap with personality disorder. They're very different than a person like a serial killer, where the typical story is that they've been brooding from childhood about some right that they want to wrong, a wrong that they want to right, and then fantasizing about it for years and years, and then sort of building up the dopamine excitatory process, where first you're stealing underwear or breaking into homes, and then you commit your first sexual assault, and then a murder, and then another murder, etc. It's a very different thing. So that I think when you're looking at somebody like this with a personality, if he's guilty, if the personality is as obviously involved as it seems, and there's that long brooding process that seems to go back years and years and years, that starts to feel to me a lot more like the personality structure of a serial killer. Now, in that 11.78% of people who go on to be serial killers or had already killed who are mass murderers, what you see is a lot of things that are very serial killer like butchering the people in a very cruel way with a blade, and then trying to outsmart the police and hide evidence and scope out your next house where you're going to go try to commit the crime again and look for attention and write all over the internet and draw attention to yourself. A lot of that stuff feels much more serial killer like in terms of the overall picture. And what I think the key to the whole thing is that a mass murderer is kind of sated by doing what they do, or they commit suicide. They explode, they express themselves, and it's done. It's a communication, their life is over, or they've made a point. A serial killer is not sated, because the whole point is that they're trying to perfect something over and over again, so that you get the sense that they would say, well, I made mistakes last time, it didn't satisfy my needs. So I think this has much more the feeling of a person who would not be done, in terms of the excitement. So this is and I will say, while we're on the subject of the motives of people that are more serial killer like, Kerri, you told me something earlier that I thought was fascinating. You said that there was an article, I think it was TMZ, you said, that said that your father expressed envy of the attention that Bryan Kohberger is getting in the press. And I thought this was something that would be very worthwhile to mention to the group. I mean, it's publicly reported, but what an interesting insight, right? And so, if it's okay, I think it would be a good time to maybe tell the group about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So right after Kohberger was arrested, it came out that he studied under Dr. Catherine Ramsland in his undergrad and master's program at DeSales University in Pennsylvania. I deal with PTSD, one of the joys of my life. And I was relieved to hear that Kohberger had been arrested. I instantly was sort of back to my own 2005 arrest of my father and, how that was handled. And then thinking of Kohberger's family and their no-knock warrant. And then when I heard the Ramsland connection, I got really ill, nauseated, and was dealing with active PTSD for about a day. I wasn't going to say anything publicly, and then it was kind of getting ahead of me in the media. And so I made a statement simply on Twitter, and then my life went nuts for a few weeks, and now here I am. I had concerns that Kohberger could have contacted my father via letters, It's very common for the general public to write my father. It can be common, especially with criminology students. So I had put that concern out there. So of course, my father has access to TV and radio, newspapers. So TMC contacted my father through a jail app called Getting Out. I didn't even know my father had electronic communication. So as a victim, I had to process that. That took about a day. Finding out through the media, my father had electronic communication. I verified it, that it was actually, he does have access to this app. And my father said no, that he had not had contact with Kohberger, but he said he was sure Kohberger had studied him in class, which of course we know. I mean, especially under Dr. Ramslin and her Dangerous Minds serial killer class, obviously my father would be studied. Ramslin's basically an expert on my father. And then my father wanted to make sure and point out that, you know, my family, that he loved my family very much, but we haven't been in contact. So he wanted to push that in there, you know, let everybody in the world know that, you know, because he's a narcissist. And then he mentioned he wanted to compare his own crimes to Kohberger's. And so he educated all of us in that way too. My father is a sexual sadistic psychopath, pathological liar, and a narcissist. So whenever you're talking about my father, you need to keep those things in mind. So giving my father a microphone, this is what happens very quickly, where he has to insert himself back in and bring up his own crimes and make sure people are paying attention to him. It's just my father. It's never been any different for my father.
Thank you for your revealing your brutal soul honesty here in terms of what you've been, you know, suffering all of these years. I think everybody on this panel, we understand that we don't understand what you've experienced, and nor could we ever. But we do understand that you have survived something that is of a depth that I don't think the human condition, unless you've been in it, is capable of quite, grasping, wrapping their mind around it. And, you know, thank you for your willingness to put it out there for a moment there, because I know that's not very easy. But at the same time, I respect you for the fact that I really know that deep down inside you feel the importance of what your mission is through your advocacy to helping these types of problems. And so thank you for sharing just even that little piece of who you are. I'm grateful for that. Getting back into Greg for a second, with what we just heard, Greg, what are your thoughts on?
As to whether or not he either killed before or would kill again, I certainly think he would have killed again. Whether or not he's killed before, I guess the way I would put it from my perspective, because there's still much that we don't know about those crime scenes from a behavioral aspect, and that having to do with the difference between the MO and the signature aspect. If there was a signature involved, typically that would suggest to us, certainly they're going to offend again, but it also often suggests to us that they have also killed before. Because signature just doesn't happen generally, but rather over time in experience, not necessarily in one event. But so it very well may be that he has not, but to say that at the same time, if we found out that he did, I would not be surprised if he tried, albeit it may have been a miserable failure. But I do believe that he did take, there were precursors to this, that there were things that he was involved in leading up to the event. And as we look at this from a behavioral perspective, I can't speak to the personality issues, which are so insightful, but I look at it from a behavioral perspective. He's 28 years old. He's been around a while, and he's had problems for a long time, a lot of interpersonal problems. And the development of these personality issues has been over time. He wasn't born that way, in my estimation. And so these difficulties that he's been through were manifest in various ways. And I think that they were manifest in miscellaneous nuisance types of offenses to begin with over time: peeping, stealing of underwear, burglarizing and watching people sleeping, those types of things, which very well could have been even in this case. We don't know. We know that he was there several times. I wouldn't be surprised that he had been in that house a number of times. I wouldn't be surprised if he had burglarized them and watched them while they were sleeping, had taken things from them. So he may not have committed a homicide before, but I think he's been fantasizing about it for a long, long time. We don't know about the signature aspect, if there is one. The fact that it's a violent, interpersonal, up close and violent crime with I believe to be sexual undertones. Although he may be an offender that could not have acted out in that way, and that in some ways one might argue, well, is it possible that a knife could be a substitute aspect of a sexual assault? Certainly possible. That's not for me to say, as I don't have that kind of a background, but maybe Gary would like to jump on that just for discussion purposes. What we might call a substitute sexual activity, and that there were 4 people involved. And we don't. I suspect that there was at least one, if not 2, that he was particularly fixated on. I'm not convinced that he was fixated on all 4 at this point. May have been a circumstantial situation, as I think Kerri mentioned, or one of the panel members mentioned that he probably started at the top floor and moved down, and circumstantially may have seen or gotten involved in a situation where he had to take some action because of what was going on and the responses that the victims had as he walked down those stairs. We don't know that he in fact saw that the surviving victim. She saw him, but we don't know that he saw her for sure. He was caught up in a highly dramatic and emotional situation. The stress was at peak, but he was also enjoying a level of, I think, chemical release and satisfaction that put him in a mental state, knowing that he had to get out of there. May not have been quite as observant as he may have been otherwise. Otherwise, why would he allow that victim to have survived? So those are some of the things that I look at, and there's a level of confidence to be able to go into that home under those set of circumstances and to kill successfully to begin with for several weeks, 4 people. To think that he hasn't been engaged in some precipitating and preceding activity suggests to me that he most likely was at one level or another.
Hey, and Dr. Bacar, before you weigh in real fast, I want to hear from Dean. Dean, what do you think about this conversation so far?
Well, obviously, I'm not at the level of all of these folks, so I don't know. I got a lot to add, but I think a couple of things did come to mind. One is, I think when what Greg was just talking about, this idea that there were other experiences that he had. I think a lot of times people think, well, then why didn't he get caught, right? I mean, if he's doing all of these major things, but I think one of the things to keep in mind, I don't think it was something that somebody observed all of these things together. They were isolated things that he had this experience over here, and it was that somebody kind of, you hear about it and you go, well, that's weird or that's off, but it's not the full deal. If you could get all of these people in a room to talk about their experiences, then you're able to put all the pieces to the puzzle together. I think what happened that night was a lot of things came together. And so now we have a crime scene. We have all these things, but he was out peeping there. We know he spent time. I think that's what we talked about early on, was just the location of that home and the way the back end was. It just lended itself so much to that kind of behavior. But I think any of these isolated things, it may be one little thing here, one little thing there. And I think it's definitely something that law enforcement in surrounding agencies should be looking at. Any kind of behaviors. He may have done some things in other areas that didn't rise to the level of obviously this case. But I think it's something that they definitely want to see if they can't connect some dots. So that would be my thought.
Okay, Dr. Kerri?
Well, what I found really fascinating about this case are the little anecdotes that come from people who encountered Kohberger, the suspect, where they give you a little window into what it was like to know him in ordinary life. Some of the ones that have really stood out to me that have been very interesting. One was a young woman who went on a date with him that had met him on Tinder. And he was able to pull off, attaining interest from a conventionally attractive young woman. They went on a date. She then says that he got a little bit pushy about wanting to come upstairs. And then in lieu of the normal advances or attempts to sort of engage in some kind of romantic activity, she says that he wanted to tickle her. And she found this very strange, and she locked herself in the bathroom pretending to vomit. And he sort of waited around, and then she couldn't get rid of him. And then he finally left. And then he sent her a bizarre message saying that he left, and he wanted to comment that she had very good birthing hips. Never went with him again. I thought that was very interesting. Another little anecdote that I thought was interesting was that a reporter went and sort of knocked on the door of the people who lived downstairs from Kohberger. And the woman said that all night long she would hear him vacuuming, using the garbage disposal, moving around, keeping strange hours, and that there was a sense that it might be upsetting to him to complain, but there was no sense of what he was doing all night. But then there are the students that encountered him in class that say that he always had to have the last word. He was extremely controlling. He was condescending. He could be kind of nasty. He was always exhausted with a big cup of coffee. Who knew what he was doing all night long? That was kind of interesting. And then one of the weirdest stories of all was that there was a podcaster that put in a FOIA request to get information on body cam footage from the police from the street where the house was located. And there was an incident just near the house where the murders happened that occurred in March when, as I understand it, Kohberger would have been studying remotely. So no one knows where he was. And the incident was that a young woman, similar in age and in many ways in appearance to the victims, reported to the police that her car was meticulously broken into. The objects in her car were neatly placed into a suitcase that was put outside the car, and her underwear were stuffed into the cup holder and displayed in some weird way. And the police interpreted it that it was a robbery attempt gone haywire or a prank, and the incident was sort of dismissed, and that was the end of it. And I can't help but wonder, about these kinds of things, if we're going to find this pattern sort of coming together around this person that starts to fall right into the narrative that Greg and Ann and I are talking about, where we're going to start to see that There was stalking behavior, sort of getting increasingly weird with people and keeping weird hours and stalking and dreaming of what he was going to do and all of that. And if that incident with the underwear and the cup was related, I mean, we're talking about a process that would have started something like 5 months before going in. We don't know for sure if it was related. It could be a total red herring, but it was right near the house, and it is intriguing. So, I just think a lot is going to come out about his personality if he is the offender. That's going to start to sound an awful lot like the typical story we hear in a serial offender. Now, the other thing I'll say quickly is that I think what we have to understand here is that ego was so much a part of this guy's motive, right? That this was a guy who was a kind of who was attempting to reduce people to a predictable kind of scientific process because he couldn't read people very well. No matter what he did, they found him weird. He could sort of engage a person or get himself into a position of power or whatever, but then everyone immediately thought he was odd. And I think that he tried everything in the book, even to the point of like, maybe if I loosen up with drugs or cope with this with drugs, maybe if I lose weight and become more physically attractive, maybe if I get more assertive, maybe if I, etc. Maybe if I study criminology and get a doctorate. But finally, I think decided the only way to gain control over people is just to tell them what to do and kind of hurt them and force control onto them. But I think what made him screw up was that he doesn't read people well. I think that's the whole thing. He couldn't anticipate what was going to go on when you get a bunch of scared people that are waking up to somebody hurting them, one of whom was a male who may have hit him or attacked him. Maybe one of the women hit him or attacked him. And, it sort of comes together to suggest that a combination of ego and underestimating how poorly he understood people taught him, led to his capture. And so that's the way I would think about it, is that he was sort of a weird guy. And I think at some point in the conversation, Chris, I think we should get into his postings online about his psychiatric symptoms that were present even in adolescence. Whether they were related to drugs or preceded drug use is all unclear. But I just wonder what the group thinks about all these little stories that are popping up about him. And I wonder if everybody agrees that they sound an awful lot like the kind of offenders we study that are serial offenders.
Yeah, when the first incident that you were referring to about the car and the rearranging of the bag, and it was a young, college student. She's getting ready to leave, and her bag has been repacked, left behind her car, and then her undergarments or underwear is found in the center console in a cup holder in the vehicle. And there's also, it looked like the fuses had been interfered with in her vehicle. But as we all discussed it, that was a couple of previous months prior to really, this gentleman showing up in the environment. But to your point, I think it's fascinating that if he was studying remotely, could he have gone into that? Because that would be the type of behavior I would suspect and, submit that would be consistent with the buildup of, and the house, by the way, is like right there. It's the house that looks right into the sliding glass door. And, one does wonder if that case is correlated, and the dog, the skinning of the dog, which, by the way, the authorities still have sealed to this day. They have not released any details on that case. And that poor pup, was left today. And it was less than, I think, maybe a couple hundred yards away from the front door of the residence at about 2:30 in the morning. So we know that kind of fits his MO. So that's my thinking. Anybody else?
I would venture to say that he's 28 years old and is, assuming this is his first episode, he's killed something before. he's engaged in some kind of activity to experience the use of that knife and what it felt like to use the knife in the taking of some life. And most likely, obviously, if it's not a human being, then it's most likely an animal. But he's experienced it at some level, certainly in fantasy, but I think he's acted it out in some level on whether it be an inanimate object, a mannequin, or an animal, for example. The other thing, which you brought up, Kerri, I think is, all these characteristics that we're talking about are consistent with the kinds of folks that we've dealt with over the years. And I think that's one of the reasons he picks the time, the place, and the circumstances that he picked to attack these victims. They're asleep. It's in the early morning hours. Whether or not he knows that they've been drinking, we don't know that for sure. But there's probably a presumption there because he's been watching them for a long time. I think he knows a certain level of familiarity with their lifestyle. And so he selects a time and a place and circumstances that elevate his potential for success and elevates the risk level, decreases his risk level, elevates their risk level, in that they're most vulnerable at that particular time and place. And I think that is also indicative of some of those inadequate personality characteristics that we're talking about.
Kerri, thoughts?
Well, it had been reported that Kohberger had moved to Washington by August because his first stalking incident was around the 22nd. But then 2020 had just run a special where somebody was doing haircuts on Kohberger. And she showed a screenshot that he had received a haircut as early as July 7th. Now, that's the earliest I had seen reported of him being in Washington. I haven't seen that anywhere else. I was sure it was August. He would have graduated from DeSales. They had a walk in May, but they were in quarters. And so he was still finishing classes in June based on my research. So he wrapped up classes the end of June, about the 30th. So he maybe was out of Washington by the 7th. I did question that date. I haven't been able to authenticate if it was July or August, but we do know that he was there by August. One of my questions was, we found out that Washington State University has access to a crime lab with cameras. Now, there was a whole process to be able to access those cameras, a screening process, and signing in and signing out with locked doors. Fox News reported this. My question is, because of how easy it is to access body cams, and Kohberger was studying cyber forensics. So I'm wondering, is it possible, could he have FOIA'd body cams before the murders to stalk these women cyberly? I mean, that's one of my questions that's out there that we don't know, because I'm sure there would have to be records if he did, try to access these records, or did he get into that lab? We don't know. And another question then, going back to Gary, did he travel out there in March possibly to visit the university or to apply to the PhD program? I don't think that's been answered. I do know he was taking some of his master's courses remotely, but he was also on campus because there's reports of him arguing with Dr. Ramslin and having access to the DeSales crime lab. So there was a combination of online and in-person classes. Plus, you have to remember that's during COVID, so he was more remote. So I agree with Gary, he maybe could have been traveling around. So while they need to be checking Pennsylvania, they might need to be checking other unsolved crimes and other weird oddities. There's also the Instagram thing that just came up, supposedly that he was contacting some of the female victims through instant messaging. Now, did they ever see them? Honestly, I ever go as a female over to my other messages. So it's definitely possible they didn't see them. So the question is, did he target and fixate on them in August when he was driving around, what my father would call trolling? Or was he cyber stalking them earlier through their social media? That's another thing I've wondered about.
Right. And but I'll just jump in and say something very quickly, because it gets to something Kerri had mentioned to me earlier that I said I think would be great to raise in the group, which is that as I understand it, Kohberger also reached out to law enforcement to say that he would like to volunteer with them to teach them how to do surveillance, and which almost makes you wonder if the point was to get the jump on what they would know if they were surveilling, and the kind of arrogance of, like, I'm going to do this right under their nose. Now, you had mentioned to me, Kerri, this story about your father taking you to a parking lot and teaching you how to not be preyed upon. And it was the very parking lot in which somebody had been abducted or attacked, right? Wasn't that the story? So that there's this kind of perverted idea of, I'm doing something to help the law and to help the world and to help you, and right under your nose, kind of sadistically giggling that you don't realize who they are, and and that's another quality of the personality I think is very disturbing here, is the question of, are you studying about criminology because you're controlling your own dark side, or is it more like to get the jump on who's going to be coming after you and to outsmart people? And we've certainly seen that in other offenders. I can't tell you how many serial killers carries, but how many of them wanted to be cops or pseudo cops. Wasn't your father was a security guard in security, right?
No,
Security of houses.
no. So my father was in the military in the
Oh,
he was supposed to go to college and he was terrible at it. So he knew, my grandpa told him, you're going to get drafted. My grandpa was a World War II veteran. And my dad has 3 younger brothers. And my grandpa said, look, you guys are going to get drafted, so you need to just go sign up. So my father was in the Air Force from 66 to 70. Now, he didn't see any action, but he traveled overseas into Turkey and Korea and Japan. And he actually was experimenting with bondage with prostitutes, according to my father, in Asia. One of his first sexual experiments then. Earlier, you were talking about the Kohberger and the young woman. There's a lot of immaturity with somebody like my father. He had a hard time with women in high school, didn't really know how to approach them, or got too fixated on them, got kind of lovesick is a word my father used. My father really didn't have any relationships until he met my mom. It was a quick 9 months, and then they got married. So my father did have what, as far as we know, is a natural, normal, almost and a loving relationship with my mom. But there is still an immaturity to my father. Like with my father's crimes, they were very sexually motivated, but he never raped. He would masturbate next to the victims after their deaths or while they were dying, but there wasn't like a penetration type rape or anything like that. That would have, to my father, that was crossing the line. Even my father has lines, and that was one of his lines. Back to the security guard stuff. No, my father, after the military, my dad loved badges and uniforms. He just loved to he loved to have a uniform, even if it was just to take the garbage out. It looked different than taking out the trash and walking the dog. He loved his Boy Scout uniform. He was never a cop. I swear to the Lord that he took the test to be a cop, but the police said no. I swear he went in and did it. He was always sort of a wannabe, wanted to be a cop. So he was a compliance officer. He was in ADT, so he was in security. So after the Otero murders, there was a big upswing in Wichita community families wanting to have security systems. And so my father actually got a job installing security systems because of the crimes he had committed. And he always enjoyed that, a little irony that he was in people's houses, why they were all very scared of him. And then in 91, he became a compliance officer in Park City, in the suburbs we live north of Wichita. And he totally overhauled the whole thing. His uniform, he created a uniform and had a badge, and he had a nightstick and a knife, and he carried a shotgun in his truck. And he looked like something right out of a country sheriff, literally down to the brown uniform. And he worked down the hall from the cops. And then he kept all of his BTK binders and whatnot in his office down the hall from the cops, and thought that was all very fun too. D'Angelo, Golden State, he was a cop and a criminology student. So he's another big one that has that same sort of profile. Back to your question, did Kohberger, do I think that he went into criminology for what we call white hat purposes, or did he already know he had the chance to be a black hat? I think it was probably both. I know my father really wished he had just been a normal person. It was a huge struggle, like you were talking about, back to childhood, of kind of fighting off those demons and then finally just giving into them. And then once you cross that line, it gets easier and easier after that. So I do believe, based on what you're saying and what we know, Kohberger struggled with a lot of those same things that we know my father did and many of these type of predators.
Dr. Burgess, what's going through your mind?
I wanted to go back to Kerri on the timeline because I'm still, he finishes supposedly his master's in May, and then is admitted, if I got it correct, in August, September to Washington. And so that's what does he do over the summer? But the minute he gets to Washington, he's really into planning his the murder, the alleged murder. We want to be careful to say, of course. So he really isn't in the program long enough to learn too much. Am I correct? Unless the Washington starts early in the summer. That's what I don't know. I was always interested in the papers he wrote. And what kinds of things did he write about? And can you get hold of that? Because if you really want into, we talk a lot about the psychological part and personality, and Kerri is really good on that. But what we still don't know is the cognitive piece. And the cognitive piece is, how do you get into their mind? And the way you get into their mind is through social media and what they post when they're just kind of posting, not being asked questions, etc. So I think that's where there'll be a key information of, hopefully from his laptop, as well as what he posts on social media, to try to see when this all starts. Kerri had a video back, 12 years ago. Kerri, is that when he was in high school, I guess it would be, and what he was experiencing then, which sounded a lot like some of the incel cases that we're seeing now. And it will be fascinating, if we can, to study that over time and see where he is from age 16 up to age 28.
That is a fascinating insight into the cognitive aspect of this piece. How
it's what everybody wants to say, into the mind of the serial killer, right? I mean, there's books and things written on that. We're not in there. We're only in there with what they tell us. And on interview, I want to see what they write about before they're into any of this, and see then what it is. The more natural, what they call the natural progression of language.
Wasn't there some information about him attempting to do a survey out on social media?
Yeah. Yes, that was, now see, there's
That's
another
fascinating.
Another timeline thing. If he does that in a month before he graduates, that makes no sense. You don't do a survey a month before you graduate. Your paper is due. I mean, there's all kinds of really interesting, not really true statements.
Yeah.
Well, I think the thing that was interesting about that was the question is was that truly a research project that he was wanting to do, or was this more questions he's asking for his personal interest to try to understand from his perspective? What you see what I'm saying? In other words, this a project that he came up with as a result of being given an assignment, or is this something internally that's going on with him that he's trying to resolve some things, and under the guise of that? That was my thing.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's probably both.
Yeah. Both, yeah.
Because it's under DeSouth, he has to have a supervisor. I mean, BC, you can't just put out something on BC stationery. So it had some official connotation somehow, which we haven't seen. We don't get any information on that yet.
But that would be interesting then to find out what the conversations were like with that supervisor or the person that was overseeing it leading into it. I mean, obviously, I would think looking back now and seeing what he's done and that factors, you would see it through a different lens than at the time, just this as a student. So that, to me, I agree with you, Ann. I think there's so many things here that, it's hard to really get to the bottom of so many things. We're just getting.
Let me tee up. I'm sorry, Dean. Did I cut you off? I apologize. Let me tee up this next conversation here because there's so much talk about incels and serial, and incel really is a new phenomena that is just kind of emerging primarily because of the thrust of social media. So I know, Gary, you've done a lot of research in correlation with this, with obviously Elliot Rodgers being, up front and center on this problem. But kind of dive into this a little bit for our audience.
Well, first of all, incels are a subject that Ann and Victor, that was mentioned, Victor Pacheco, and I, we're interested in studying. I think the way you want to think about it is that not all involuntary celibates are violent, but there are some, and it adds a certain scope or flavor to the particular hostility that individual has. And there are a wide range of reasons why a person would have difficulty connecting with potential romantic partners. I think that if the particular suspect we're talking about had that trouble, I think it has to do with that kind of oddness and that weirdness. What's interesting is that despite it, there must have also been a kind of compartmentalized quality to this person where he could also win people over and charm them and get a supervisor to not understand that there was this other part of the self that obviously was concealed completely, was able to kind of be leaderly and in charge of a group at school, was able to get someone to go on a date, even though it all kind of went haywire. So that there must have been at least, like what Keckley called the mask of sanity when he wrote about psychopathy, right? There must have been something like that. And I think that's why when we get into the mental health question, which, we don't want to get too speculatory about, but I think that when we get into that, we have to say whatever was going on, you have to imagine a person that knew a little bit how to turn it off and on, because otherwise they wouldn't have gotten where they got. They would have somewhere along the line been considered to be kind of unwell and just that odd. And so that what I find very intriguing about this is you have somebody who might have had a lot of trouble with dating and romantic relationships and all that, but there's this other element of kind of putting on a mask and faking it a little bit to win people over. And I think that's a really fascinating question that I think says something about his personality that, again, starts to sound a lot more like the serial type of offender. Because mass murderer types, they tend to be people that it's like they're so bad at it, at socializing, that they often can't even fake it. A serial killer type of person is the type of person who would meticulously study how to act like a regular person to win the confidences of children or women or other victims. What faces do you make? What gestures do you do? What kind of thing do you hone over time? What remarks to make to get someone to go home with you, willingly? And this seems to me like somebody that learned how to chameleon normal behavior by analyzing it and then faked it enough to get and that's, I think, adds a disturbing part of the personality. And I wonder what everybody else thinks about that, but he must have faked it a little bit to get as far as he did. I mean, and Greg, Dean, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think you're right, Gary. I think he had to fake it, although he didn't do very well on the interpersonal level. And but in terms of his other achievements, definitely he was able to set goals and accomplish them, which we find so often that's a real problem for a lot of these folks, that they're not able to focus their attention long enough to do anything legitimate, accomplish significantly legitimate things, and certainly accomplishing an educational level of achievement is significant. And you don't see that very often with serial offenders that we've dealt with. Not often. We certainly see it, but not often. Yeah. And it'd be interesting to know what kind of jobs that he's had and what those relationships were like with his supervisors and how long he kept those jobs. friends that he's had over the years and how long they lasted and what kinds of interests that he showed. And go ahead.
And Dr. Burgess, I mean, you, Gary and Victor are really the pioneers of this new incel research. I mean, the depth that you guys have been going through to get, to the place that we're at. I mean, again, you're a legend, a pioneer legend, headed in directions that our social, fabric really takes. So, what say you? What are your thoughts?
Well, we have a project going on. I think Gary alluded a little bit to it, where we're looking at. We've got a number of cases where we have a lot of social media posts of specifics, and we have them, those that have killed and those that haven't, and we're going to compare them to see, because right now law enforcement is really needing this, because they're getting all these. I'm sure Greg or Dean can say they're getting all of these incoming concerns. Somebody just said that they found this posted, blah, blah, whatever it is. And so how do you tell the difference? They can't go running around arresting people that haven't committed any kind of an infraction yet. So I think that that's important. We're going to try to get that going as well. We have it going. It's a matter of how can we get some early, what we call proof of concept, to be able to go more outwardly with it. So that's important. I think that we're doing, and that's with the incel group. And I had a quick question on, this guy was with a group. It was an academic group. This isn't like he was stuck in some little corner, nobody saw him, or he was working some odd job. That he was out there, that people should have picked up some things. I mean, were there red flags that should have been picked up? We always talk about that. And why weren't they? Why were they missed? I mean, Gary has a whole list of little things that happen. And sure, singularly, it doesn't necessarily mean a lot, but put together, there's your pattern. So why was he missed? Why was this missed? And even the behavior afterwards. Some of you described how often he was back and forth, and that little white car or whatever was seen in a lot of places, and yet not picked up. So I'm hoping that we will get information when more comes out. I guess we have to wait till June. I don't think, hopefully nobody's leaking it, but that there would be more information out there. And I think incels is a new area to look at. We don't know whether it's an extension of an existing group or whether it's a brand new typology. Lots of questions. And I think I wanted to see whether Kerri had anything she wanted to say in regard to your dad, your father, in terms of how you would see him now as you look back, given the information you have on these kind of current cases. Is there anything that you've learned that would help us, if that you didn't pick up at the time but now have?
Yeah, just going real back quick to the research. It was approved by a research board. It has an acronym. It was like in spring of last year, and it was approved. But I do believe, like Dr. Gary said, I have a feeling he had sort of an alternative motive when he was writing those questions, and wanting to really, not just from a research point, a sterilized perspective, but also really wanting to know what it felt like to commit these crimes. If you go back and look at the questions, there was also a quick survey basically to rule out like the narcissism, psychopathy type traits in the people answering, the offenders answering the questions. So it was done on Reddit. He posted his academic email. He posted all his research information and said it was approved by the board. I do believe he was still finishing school and in June of 2022, even though he had walked earlier, and then quickly went out to Washington. And I guess one of my questions was this the first time Kohberger was living alone? And did that sort of feed into this deviancy of leading to murder so quickly? Because, there's no reports of where he lived in Pennsylvania. His parents' home was 40 minutes from the college. If he was home during, COVID times remotely, I have a feeling maybe moving and being on his own was a trigger here. My father also, he was in the military. He lived with his parents after the military and then got married. And then his first murders were a couple years after he was married and living on his own. But speaking back to like the chameleon, well, Gary had a good point about, okay, in hindsight, we're over here now saying, okay, we believe this person has committed these crimes, and we can pull all these little things, weird oddities and whatnots or small crimes. We can go back and pull all this together, or, you know, we're so far out with my father, we can go read in his own words all these little behaviors my father had going back a couple decades before he committed these crimes. It's much easier sitting on this side of it to go back in hindsight and find all these things. Now, when you're talking about a chameleon, Gary was saying somebody like Kohberger was maybe learning how to try to be more human. I'm over here arguing against all the rest of you that my father was as human as how human could be, but also a psychopath. Now, I know you all will argue with me because you've all been in the trenches for so long that a psychopath cannot love and not be fully human and not fully care and have empathy. But I'm telling you, my father was both. And, you know, one of the reasons I am so vocal now in speaking up is because I am rare to have lived with somebody like this, survived somebody like this, you know, able to talk about it. And maybe I'm all messed up because he's my father, because, you know, a retired detective will argue with me and say, every day of your life was a lie. And I'll say, no, it wasn't. Stop that. You know, don't mess me up anymore, please.
Remember, we started this program tonight with how empowering you are. And I get exactly where you're coming from, speaking, you know, as an investigator for working, you know, murder for so many years. I know exactly where you're coming from. And I think people don't understand how compartmentalized you were. Mm-hmm. And that your life is, you're seeing the Boy Scout leader, you're seeing the, you know, the Methodist, you know, guy going to church, you're seeing the daddy-daughter, you know, hanging the Christmas trees, you know, lights, and all of the normal behaviors of a family that has this unbelievable piece of thing that nobody can comprehend on the other side of this vortex. Okay. You are literally in the tornado. You're in an F5 tornado, but you don't realize it's destroying everything around the neighborhood because you're in a very safe cocoon. I get exactly where you're coming from. And thank goodness you're speaking out and helping people to understand that you did not commit these crimes. Your father did. Okay. And I think sometimes our society and social media has made it, use, and keep me honest here, okay? Social media has made it 10,000 times more worse, because instantaneously people can sit behind the keyboard, and as Dr. Gary and Ann and others have talked about, and Dean and Greg and myself and thousands of others have said, yeah, but who are you? You're an you're just an avatar. Who are you? And of course, those identities will never present themselves. And yet you have to be subject to those identities, as do I, by the way. Ask how many people hate retired cops. Okay. Just follow the chat sometimes, or the comments, and you're going to see, man, you and I, Kerri, we're going to get jackets, and we'll throw jackets, you know, with a terminology on the back. But these are, you know, I applaud you for being brave. I applaud you for being authentically honest about your situation. The fact that you have dealt with this all of your life, and you will continue to deal with it all your life. It doesn't just go away. So thank you for being 100% vulnerable to the whole situation. Am I making sense?
No, you are. And I deal with so much crap. I mean, like, there's accounts made literally to harass me on Twitter. Like, that's their sole purpose. And honestly, if I keep track of the worst of it, and the very worst does go to my local Wichita, you know, or the FBI or whoever. But honestly, if I was to report everything, that would be my day every day. And I'm not going to do that to law enforcement, and I'm not going to do that to myself. So I monitor it. And when it gets bad, then it goes where it needs to go. back to the chameleon thing, my father calls it cubing. It's a term he came up with Dr. Rawson, where he said that he would show you which side of the cube. So he would show you dad or Boy Scout leader, Lutheran church leader, volunteer son. So he could flip that cube. And he was very good at being a chameleon, but I don't know if it was something he really practiced, as it was just innate to who my father was. And when you're talking about nurture or nature, we really don't know where my father went wrong, or was he born this way? His brothers were fine. But my father was a very good mimic. So back like to the uniforms. So we went fishing and camping a lot, and we would be out fishing. And of course, like the wildlife and fish, police guys, they would come along and ask, just little things like, are you staying within your limits, and have you caught anything? And, are you behaving within your size range of fish and things? So they're just coming along naturally doing their job. And my father would mimic them, and he would switch just like that, so that he went from being like father fishing to being like a formal, like almost police officer talking police. And so he would almost put that other person he's talking to, making them feel more comfortable in their role. He would become more professional and say, yes, sir, no, sir. I saw it very often with him with uniforms, where his whole posture would change, his voice would change. He would become more formal, and it would really put the person he's talking to ease. And it's not like it's in his head thinking, okay, here comes a uniform and I'm this big bad BTK guy. It just was natural. There wasn't any sort of, even I think, a thought process of, I need to adjust myself now. He just did it just very quickly.
Kerri,
Can I just jump in quick and say something? So what's so interesting about this, and you can't ask for better illustrations of the kind of phenomena that we study as a group here, that we deal with in terms of offenders. And I have found that a lot of offenders with character structures kind of like we're talking about, one of the reasons that they like jobs that have to do with uniforms and equipment and all that is precisely because they're so poor at social skills. So the idea is the job tells you what to do in every situation. This is what you do here. This is the outfit you wear. This is where you put your badge. This is where you put your nightstick. This is where you put your gun. So that it's almost like the way a religion can work, where it tells you what to do every single day of the week at a certain time, and it gives you a sense of purpose and meaning and structure. And I think one of the most interesting things that I notice when you talk about your dad, and I think this is something that carries over to the Bryan Kohberger discussion as a suspect in these murders, is that it seems that there's this compartmentalization, and what would make your dad kind of slip over into the other side of himself was the loss of control. And you talked about with amazing vivid detail, like this incident in the house where pasta spilled all over the floor, and we talked about, you and I have talked about whether the sauce kind of reminded him of blood or something, but he felt out of control, and then he attempted to strangle, I think it was your brother, right? So that here he sort of turns into BTK for just a split second in the house, even though he's supposed to have this compartmentalization. And what I think is, when we talk about Kohberger, what I'm curious about is, if he is guilty, if it's going to turn out that he had this kind of mask, but when he felt out of control, you would get snapped at or insulted, or so it's sort of like the date where everything is fine until he's up in that house and the woman doesn't want to do anything that he wants to do, and then he gets weird. It all falls apart. He doesn't know what to do at that moment, how to fake it anymore. So then he just gets, the control thing comes out. He gets mean. He gets outrageous. So that I think, I bet that you could come up with lots of examples of where this would happen, where your father would lose control and this other thing would come out. And if I remember correctly, you've talked vividly about how even his eyes would change and he would become almost dark looking or scary looking when he lost control. Am I making sense? Does this resonate with you?
No, that's exactly it. And you make a good point about control. My father, everything was control from my father. So we used to tease him about being a bit OCD and neurotic, and he did not like being teased. So you had to do it with the thought that you were going to be punished for teasing your father. But from when I was little, I lived in a very controlled household. So I knew from when I was tiny to keep the shoes picked up and mind my P's and Q's. And we had to look a certain way when we went to church. We had to present ourselves a certain, well-dressed and upstanding citizens. Some people said he used my family as a cover. I don't think that's true. I think he had natural relationships with us and looked very normal. I don't think it was an act. I think he just had that other side that would come out. So I think you do make a good point, Greg, about I lived in it. It's hard to see the forest from the trees. And Gary made a good point that, like with the tornado, I lived with this thing. And as a little girl, I was always scared of telling my mom. I would wake up screaming and say, there's a bad man in my house. Was I sensing something about my father, that we realize now, and I live with night terrors back from his 85 crime, the murder of the neighbor down the street. My father actually said those empowered him. He was worried about me, but they also empowered him. That I was screaming at night after, the neighbor was murdered. The control is a big, huge thing. So yes, my father always wanted to be in control. And I think that's very interesting about the uniforms because it does give a layer of control. Even when he was wearing normal clothes, like when we went to college football games, he had a whole uniform to look just like somebody going to a college game and he fit right in. I assumed it was more a chameleon thing, but I also think it does go back to control because it made him more comfortable. Everything was a uniform to my father. Everything was control. Everything was planned. Like when we would vacation, he loved planning vacations. He loved packing. With his murders, he loved the premeditation parts and the planning and the preparation. He really enjoyed all of that in the fantasy more than the actual act and then the recreation of it after. And when you're talking about these moments in my life where I got a tiny glimpse of that, the psychopath side, the BTK side, extremely memorable, extremely traumatic, extremely awful, where like this other very angry, very dark person came out of my father and his eyes would change and they would get beady. They would change to very dark, almost black. These moments where he started to lose control. He threatened me once when I was a teenager. He ran after me in the living room. My mom stepped in and bought me some time. He almost kicked down my door. When I was a young adult, there was an argument at dinner. There had been a lot of grief. We had lost my cousin. My dad's father was dying. We had a family argument, and all of a sudden my dad just sprung up from the table, started strangling my older brother. I was 18. My brother was 21. Happened again like 3 years after that. I think in hindsight, it took me even like 10 years to like come to terms with terms of people saying, hey, you're a crime victim or you're an abuse victim, you're a trauma victim. Those were not terms I ever used about myself after his arrest. I honestly had even disassociated from that attempted strangulation of my brother. Nobody talked about it. The question came up on Twitter just the other day. What would have happened in 1996 if my family had reported my father for this? Would he have been arrested for, domestic violence? Would everything else have come out? Would we have caught him 9 years before we did? Or would my family have been in trouble? I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is over here in hindsight, you can put all these pieces together and say, hey, how did we miss this guy for 30 years? Or how did we miss Kohberger, in these academic fields? But before they're caught, I don't know. It's just tiny little things. And it's not like like you said, it's not like you're getting everybody in a room to talk about it.
Dean, you've been quiet over there, and somebody wanted to have you breathe, blink, and speak.
Well,
Hey,
I thought it was
Dean, what about? I was going to say, Dean, isn't there a story that you're familiar with about the Boy Scout meeting, an individual that had met Kerri's dad. Could you share that with the audience?
Yeah, so my wife and I were remodeling our house, and we had gone to a store to purchase some flooring. And the gentleman that was the manager there, I was off to the side. My wife was really engaged, and he said, "What do you do for a living?" And so I told him that I was the deputy executive director for the Cold Case Foundation. And he said, "Did you?" When I said that, he said, "You mean like serial killers and all that kind of stuff?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, a lot of that type of thing. And he said, "Well," he said, "some people shouldn't be around children." And I said, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And he said, "Well," he said, there was a Boy Scout leader. He said, "I was a Boy Scout." And he said, "I was at a jamboree." And he said, "For an entire week," he said, we camped next to this guy who had a troop there." And he said, "What really stuck out with me is that he was extremely rigid with these kids on all the knots that they could tie, on how they had to do it." And he said, and it's almost like a cop coming around to our place and checking all of our stuff. And he said, and I found out later that this guy was a serial killer. And I looked at him and said, "Dennis Rader?" And he said, "Yes. How did you know?" And I said, "Well, the way that you described it to me." And he had a perspective of even the way he was working with the kids when it came to certain things. Now, not everything, but particularly with the knots. And he said he almost ran it like a military. His little unit was like this military thing. I thought that was a very interesting insight. But I also was going to just say this to you, Kerri. I read your book, and I thought, kind of along what we're talking about, there was an interesting story that you tell in there about, I think you ended up in an apartment and there was a lot happening, your fear, and you talk about being concerned about, your security in that home and everything. And if I remember the story correctly, I think your dad actually came down at your behest to check your apartment and give you insight and everything. Is that, am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, but let's go back to the jamboree. Well, I don't doubt somebody was that controlling, and sounds like my father. He never went to a jamboree with the kids. He went to the Plymouth Scout Ranch out in southeastern Kansas for a week with the Boy Scouts, and he was the leader. And
he had been there for a week. No, and I may be wrong on whether it was a jamboree.
No, he would have been at the Plymouth Scout Ranch, but he never went to the big national jamborees. But that guy could have ran into him at the Plymouth Scout Ranch.
Because this guy was from Kansas, so
okay, it was probably the Plymouth Scout Ranch.
Okay, then that would be what it was. Okay.
Yeah. So my father actually swam. He at a pretty advanced age, he swam the whole mile there to get a badge. So it's just an aside of my father's, imagining my father swimming a mile trying to prove himself. But yes, my father, I'm sure if he ran into him, was probably quite controlling about the knots and wanting things neat and in control. But yes, my father was a Cub Scout and a Boy Scout leader for several years. And he actually used two of the Scout campouts as alibis and covers. He used those to commit the two murders that were closest to our home that had different MOs. So he used those as covers.
So did he change his MO?
He did for 85 and 91. But going back first to college, so the 91 murder was a couple miles from my house, Mrs. Davis, and he had been stalking her. He was doing night work at a grocery store and had fixated on her. He was trying to make extra money. He was unemployed at the time, and he was depressed, and he actually was suicidal. I forgot to tell Dr. Gary that last time. Both before the 74 murders and the 91, when he was out of work, he was suicidal. My father reports. So it drives him into sort of to the really bad places, is what my father says. So in 91. In January of 91, he left Trappers Rendezvous, the Boy Scout winter campout, and he threw a cement brick into Mrs. Davis's screen glass door and then proceeded to murder her. He actually moved her body around twice, one time using our family car. He went back to visit it while he was still on the camp out. He almost got caught. He was in a bathroom, a public bathroom, changing his clothes after moving Mrs. Davis. A police officer came in. That was the closest my father ever got caught because he had stuff in his car. He was sure he was going to be caught, but he wasn't. So as a 7th grader, I was dealing with a very depressed father, a sick mother that had been in the hospital, very moody, dark father at the time that was trying to manage things and cook, not a very good cook inside. It was a bad time for our family. And then things got better. So my father, once he murdered somebody, there was a release where all this pent up anger and frustration would be released. And then my father was in a much better mood, which now I can go back in hindsight and see that. So when I was in 7th grade, then I had vaguely heard about this woman murdered in a screen glass door. So I became scared, basically terrified of screen glass doors. Then in college, I was going to rent an apartment my last 2 years. And so I called my father. I said, I found a 1-bedroom, but it has a screen glass door, and that's the only entrance and exit. It doesn't feel very safe. He said, well, do you have any other windows? And I said, well, it's a 2nd floor. I could maybe climb out of the window and drop down. I would be hurt in a fire. But he said, well, tell me where it's located. And I said, well, it's on a well-lit corner. There's a Pizza Hut. There's lights. There's people. It's very active corner. And he said, no, you'll be safe on that corner. Nobody's going to mess with you on that well-lit, active corner. And he said, we'll take a broom and we'll cut off the top of it or screw the broom and just use the handle. So he rigged up a handle for a broom to lock the door so that when I was inside, nobody could just open the door. Now this was in 2001. So he had killed Davis using a screen door 10 years before that. In 2003, my last fishing trip was with him. Then I got married. I moved to Detroit. I saw him 2 more times. So, and then he was arrested. And then I found out that he was the one that had committed Davis's murder. So I've had a massive issue with screen doors, but I would like to say I'm living with one now and mainly managing it. So it's kind of a big victory over here that I live with a screen door. There was another question. Oh, the MO, if we want to discuss this. So my father's primary MO was cutting the phone line. That was when they had the old landlines. So he would cut the landline to the point that people after those murders were going home checking to see if they had a phone signal. That was, people would go into their homes in Wichita and make sure their phones were working. So he would cut the landline and then he would go in and bind up people, torture them, and strangle them. But in 85, when he decided to murder Mrs. Hedge, she lived 7 houses down from me and 2 houses down from my mother's grandparents. So you can see into her backyard from my grandparents' home. He knew that he needed to change his MO or it would be too close to home. He didn't really want to kill close to home, but it just kind of overwhelmed him and he decided to do it. So 8 years had passed between the 77 and the 85 one. So the investigators were still sort of looking for him, but had assumed he was dead or in prison or something. And he had stopped communicating in 79. So in that case, he actually broke into her home and hid in her closet. He thought she was home because the car was there, but she was out on a date. So similar to Kohberger, had Kohberger broke into the Idaho home before, was he waiting there? Now we believe, due to the car, that he wasn't in the house waiting before, but had he been in there before hiding and had he taken things? So my dad was waiting in a closet for her to go to bed and go to sleep. And then he attacked her in her bed. One of the interesting things about 85 is the house is the same exact layout as my own home, 3-bedroom ranch, exact layout as my grandparents' home too. So the question is, when I was 6 years old, was my dad practicing this murder in my house? Was he practicing it while I was asleep in my bedroom? Did he come out of my closet and scare the crap out of me? Did I see him coming or going? Did I see him playing his mask and dress up games? why did my night terrors start then? Because when I was 6, I did know my neighbor was missing. So to change his MO, he always usually left his victims in the house. In 85, he took her out of the house after he strangled her, and he took her to our church and took Polaroids of her, dressed her up, and then took her out into the country, down a few miles actually from our church, and they found her body about a week later. So as a 6-year-old, I knew that she had been missing, and I knew her body was found strangled. And then my night terrors started, and I knew my father was gone that night. Because I knew he was at a Cub Scout camp out, and that there was a thunderstorm, and I was scared. So I was sleeping with my mom. I would have never been in my mom's bed if my dad had been home. So as a 6-year-old, I held, I guess, a couple puzzle pieces to that. But of course, how is a 6-year-old going to know? Later, after he was arrested, then they reported my father had gone to a bowling alley, had this whole roost set up with this maroon bag. I remember the maroon bag. Of course, investigators didn't know about the maroon bag until after the arrest. As a 6-year-old, I knew about this bag, vaguely. So again, there's all these little hindsight pieces. And then in 91, again, of course, that was a few miles from our house. Again, he removed the victim. Those are the only 2 times he removed the victim. And in 91, he went back to the victim to spend time with the body. So when my father was arrested in 2005, he was originally arrested on the cases in the 70s, and the 86 one, they had matched the DNA, my DNA, to all of those, to my father. But they did not arrest him on 85 and 91. And so when the FBI showed up at my house to notify me that my father was BTK, I was trying to alibi him, and I asked about dates, and he said 86. And then I remembered about Mrs. Hedge in 85 and grew very ill and almost passed out, very upset, and said, I don't think Mrs. Hedge's murder was ever solved, and I think you need to look at my father for that. And that was within like 30 minutes or an hour of being notified that my dad was BTK. So I literally turned my father in on 85.
You are an amazing young lady. Just what this says right here. God bless you, sweetheart. That's it. I mean, you are leaving a panel of experts just riveted listening to what you have been sharing with everybody here. Boy, you gave a lot of information. Was there any, a question I have that came to mind here, was there anything that, what we would call in the business, something that you could see a trigger, a precipitating event that would build, and then your dad would have, the release of that fuel? Was there anything you noticed in retrospect that there was consistency in relationship to that pattern?
Well, I don't know what led up to 85. I would have to go back and see what he said about that one. I didn't even have any memories other than about a month after or before 86. That one he actually committed. He took a lunch. He said he took a long lunch from ADT, killed a young mom while her son was in the house. And then that one was actually, the police had assumed it was her husband for a very long time. And then he actually went back to work. So when we're talking about Kohberger being able to go back to school and maintain his academics, my father was able to go home and go have dinner with his family, or go back to Boy Scouts, or, commit these horrific acts and then go right back to normal life. It didn't faze my father at all. And it, like I did say with 91, there was this long period of being depressed, dealing with depression. We know my father had. He mentions suicide thoughts, feeling very low, feeling very not like a full man, being able to support his family because he had lost his job. With between ADT and the census, he was off again, laid off. That was what my father reports before the Oteros, his first, of being laid off from work, feeling very low, feeling not masculine, and then having time on his hands. So my father talks about having time on his hands, not being occupied. So maybe Kohberger had this down period over the summer, a very short period. But Dr. Ann makes a good point of how quickly Kohberger murdered it's like he escalated just like this. There's got to be something there that we're missing in Pennsylvania, or did he latch onto them earlier? But honestly, my father latched onto the Oteros only a few weeks before he murdered them. But there's got to be a history of stalking with Kohberger. There absolutely has to be something there. The other murders, there isn't a period of depression, but there's always was a period of stalking and trolling from my father constantly, even after he was done murdering in 91. Constantly, he said stalking was just general, or trolling was general, and then he would fixate and then think, okay, well, maybe this person or maybe that person. But honestly, my father didn't necessarily always even know the names of his victims before they were murdered. He would know from the IDs he got or after they were in the news. And this is the same case as Kohberger. I don't necessarily know if Kohberger knew their names unless he had contacted them or tried to through social media or was stalking them that way. It's not unfortunately, it's a very horrific thing to say. It's not necessarily really about the victim for them. It might be something how they look or something that they fixate on in a sexual way, but it's not really personal in cases like this, as awful as it is to say to the victims' families when they ask why. There is no why, unfortunately.
Well, the other day I was talking to a friend of mine, and he said that he met a woman and instantly fell in love. It was love at first sight. And I said, well, tell me a little bit about what you were drawn to and why you like this person. Well, I had always dreamed I would meet a woman with this characteristic and that character. So I said it wasn't love at first sight, it was love at second sight, because you had a fantasy of what you were looking for, and you went out and you found somebody that met the criteria. And then when I was traveling home from this conversation, I got to thinking that in a perverse way, it's a similar thing that happens with these offenders. They have a preconceived prototype or a fantasy, and then they go out looking for somebody who just happens to fit the bill, and they're extremely interchangeable. I mean, you think about, for example, Ted Bundy at Lake Sam out there when he picked up the Ott and Naslin together the same day. And if you look at police reports and the information that was amassed, like by Kevin Sullivan, the author who wrote really the most comprehensive book on Bundy, what he figured out was that about every 15 minutes, Bundy would stop a different woman who looked sort of like the previous woman he had talked to, try to lure her, and if it didn't work out, no problem, he moved on to the next one. But they looked alike. In other words, they were that interchangeable, but they were that important because they fit the bill. It was like a casting agent that needs someone to look a certain part. And I think I can't help but think that, there was something about the physical characteristics and et cetera of the victims in this case, in this Idaho case, that really was adequate to fixate on one or all of them. But that there was no real meaningful relationship between them. It was just a glance, and you kind of fit the prototype. The other thing I would say quickly is that your depiction of your father, it's so interesting, because what you're really saying is that he would become deflated and depressed, sort of like you see in narcissism, when he was out of control and felt inadequate. And then after projecting all of that inferiority and smallness and so forth onto a victim, he would inflate and suddenly become happy and in control, and until the next time he got down. And it's funny, but interesting that people who saw Kohberger after the time of the killings said that when he came to class, he had more spring in his step and was kind of happier and more at peace and friendlier. And it's that same feeling that maybe if he is guilty, that perhaps he inflated with this act of projecting inferiority onto these people that he's now asserted dominance over. And it's terrifying to think of it that way, but we've seen it with a lot of people. And so, I mean, that may in and of itself be the motive. And then you think you've got everybody out there speculating about all these motives. And you'll notice that the motives people fantasize about, especially before Kohberger was identified, it was the father, it was the boyfriend, we project very human motives onto things like this. But I think you've got to go into the depths of depravity to understand that you could do something like this simply because, you've had a bad day and, you're down and feeling badly about yourself for a long time. And someone has to be the scapegoat for that and to play that out. Chris, I wonder if before we run out of time, are we going to speak at all about the mental health aspect, or I don't know what
Sure.
time we're ending.
Absolutely, and you guys have there's over 5,000 people here. So you have more than a half of arena listening to you. And Kerri, you are empowering so many people, and I know all of us here are, we're all learning. We're all learning from the things that you're sharing with us as well. But Greg, you had a point, and then Doc, we'll get into. And I want to hear what Ann and Dean you have going on up there. But Greg, go ahead and make.
I was going to follow up with what Gary was talking about, and when we teach the process of profiling and looking for certain types of offenders or people of interest, etc. Oftentimes, what we have found in our interviews with these folks is that it's like anybody else. We all go through stressors in life. And the difference between how an offender may deal with that stress is significantly different than how those of us who don't engage in that kind of activity. And what we look at is what we refer to as precipitating stressors. It may be something to do with the job, relationships, health, dates that are significant to them, any number of things that are creating that stress. And what does stress do to us? I think from a personal perspective, it makes me feel like when I'm under a great deal of stress that I'm beginning to lose control. And so I have to engage in those activities that will help me retrieve that control back into my life. So I can now, because as I go through that, I'm losing control. And now it's also affecting my self-esteem. I'm losing control of everything around me. I'm feeling bad. I'm feeling bad about myself because I'm losing that control, the effects that it's having on me and people around me. And we look at that very similarly with these offenders, in that they sense the same thing, and those consequences are the same thing. So what do they do to get control back in their lives? They may go out and commit this heinous crime, and particularly if they get away with it. So what does that do for them? It fills that ego up again. It increases their level of self-esteem where they feel accomplished and achieved, back in control. And it sounds kind of simplistic, but to me, it's very, there's a parallel there. The difference is in the way in which they may go about doing those kinds of things. So the satisfaction of that success brings them back into control, which were before, through those precipitating stressors, they're experiencing a dismantling and a diffusion of that control. Do you agree with that, Doc? Or?
Dr. Burgess, and then Dean, and then Kerri, you can hit us with the brain.
Hands up.
And you're muted. That's okay.
No, I was just going to defer to Gary. I think Gary had something he wanted to talk about. I don't know. I certainly agree with what Greg had to say. I don't have anything else to add to it. Gary, were you going to talk about something mental health?
No. Well, you had referred earlier to what had come up online regarding posts and things. It wasn't a video. It was postings about describing symptoms that Kohberger put online, and those were found, I believe, first by a podcast, and then New York Times published about that and sort of confirmed that Kohberger had posted that. It was interesting because there was a lot of speculation about what explained the symptoms Kohberger was talking about in late adolescence, and they were things like dissociative symptoms, looking into the mirror and seeing himself as meat, or feeling that he was living in a simulation or a video game. Interesting, by the way, that a person who became vegan would talk about this theme of seeing himself turning into meat and being disgusted by it. And he was also, if you read it carefully, he refers to faint voices. He refers to visual snow, looking at the world and it's sort of pixelated, and getting headaches and having kind of experiences from that. And he refers to grandiosity, certainly describes some paranoia. And what's interesting about this is there are a few different possible explanations, and we want to be careful not to speculate about mental health, and also to not give the impression that this is an excuse or justification for what happened later. But it certainly gives us insight into why he might have been struggling interpersonally and awkward and all that. And one thing that a lot of people said, or we're looking at this, is maybe he was dissociated because of trauma, that he had been bullied and so forth. And then you see that kind of feeling detached from yourself, like you see in people with PTSD. Kerri, you've certainly spoken eloquently about that experience, and that kind of looking at your life from 30,000 feet and feeling foreign or feeling like you're in a simulation. But my experience when I was studying severe mental illness as the assistant director of a clinic at Columbia Medical Center, and previously when I was studying these phenomena at Long Island Jewish, now Northwell, is there is a thing called the attenuated psychosis syndrome. It was included in the appendix of the DSM-5 as a condition warranting further research. During my career, I did a lot to help elucidate the phenomenology of that particular condition as it was being developed. And there's only a few groups worldwide that looked at that condition. So I'm in this weird, unique position of understanding the symptoms that were being described are all very common in people that are experiencing a kind of pre-psychotic state. Before people develop psychosis, there is a period, it can be anywhere from a few months to a year and a half, couple of years, where they feel dissociated, they have peculiar obsessions, they can be paranoid, they can be grandiose, they have faint voices, they have strange visual experiences, but they may or may not develop full-blown psychosis. And what's interesting about people like that is that, first of all, drugs can fuel it and add to it, and that was probably going on here, it sounds like. But what happens is that if the person gets through that patch without developing full-blown illness, they're still sort of eccentric for the rest of their life. And I have always thought that a lot of the people we think of as having what are called cluster A personality disorders, kind of paranoid, a little detached from human beings, a little bit weird and magical ideas and peculiar preoccupations. A lot of those people, I came to believe from my research, were once at risk of developing psychosis and didn't go over the edge. They made it, their brain kind of locked in early adulthood, and they just sort of stay a little bit peculiar. And I think that this is very interesting. This dissociative stuff is interesting when we think about, for example, being under extreme stress and committing, potentially having committed 4 murders, and then zoning out and doing things like leaving the sheath and, walking past someone and not killing them. You almost wonder if he was having these little micro dissociative kind of things that happening at that moment that would really look like lapses in attention. So that this person who had this fantasy of total control in that moment could make a mistake that goofy because under the stress of being out of control had these like dissociative kind of blips. And that is not uncommon in people of that type. I think that it's important to emphasize that with people like this, there can often be an overlap of an aberrant personality. And you put the two together and you get somebody that when they are aggressive or when they're if this turns out to be a psychopathic person or a narcissistic person, when they commit violence, there can be so much mechanical detachment and so much curiosity about human beings and how they operate, and so much of a need to control them almost as if they were animals or people in an experiment, that there's a weird element on top of the crime. And it's in cases like that that you often see the most extreme butchery. Lots of stabbing and mutilation and things like that, because the person is just so objectified and you're so curious about them and you're so interested in what you're feeling while you do it. So I suspect that as this case unravels, we're going to see that there's a person who really grappled probably with serious stuff for a little while, but also had this overarching personality structure and kind of a indignancy about feeling weird and rejected, and couldn't own that the problems were coming from inside the house, that he had difficulty with other human beings and therefore got mad at them that they rejected him. And we have to make that point when we talk about incels. No one is suggesting The incel has a right to kill someone or be mad at them just because a woman or someone else isn't interested in them. But they feel entitled to take it out on these people as if they've been cheated out of something they're entitled to. And, Kerri, you talked a little bit about your father's kind of thing of, picking people who had vulnerabilities, insecurity, screen doors, things like that. I feel like people like this sometimes punish people that they feel like themselves lack control. So if you're not taking control over your house and there's openings in it and vulnerabilities, you've got to be punished because I'm feeling I was out of control. So now I project it onto you. And I think that's an interesting part of the stalking process too for these people. So, I'm just very interested in those posts. I don't think they would exonerate a person, but I think they are interesting to think about how a person got to a place where they were just that weird with other people that all that was left potentially was to take control of them through violence. And I wonder what anybody else thinks about this, but I think we're going to hear a lot about it.
Just to quickly follow up, Gary, on an experience that I had a number of years ago talking to a serial rapist who talked about that very issue. He was good for about 85 rapes over about 5 years. And one of his victims, all the rapes that he got into, every one of them, he got in through an unlocked door or an unlocked window. And during the course of the interview, he was asked, "So you're telling me you never came across a locked door or window?" He said, "Oh yeah, of course I did." He said, "I just went on to the next one." And so there was only on one occasion where he went back to one of his previous victims and reoffended. And it was because she left her window unlocked. And one of the first things he said to her when he got back in there is, "Did I tell you not to lock your window the last time?" So I think there is an element, maybe peculiar to certain types, but there is an element there of punishment going back to some of these people.
Okay, I don't know if anybody can hear me.
What happened, Chris? Where were you, bud?
They were talking, Chris, so I didn't tell them what happened. So
Elon Musk called me and said, "Get to space as quickly as possible." So, welcome to modern technology. Anyway, I went to space. I'm back, and my computer is crashed. So I don't know what's going on with that.
Well, the show went on without you, bud.
And that's the way it should be. Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. Love you guys. Okay, so I hope everybody got a chance to talk just before everybody dropped off. Okay, good. Let me pull up a couple of these quick comments. So one of them here is, Kerri, did your father have any problem with women growing up? And if you're aware of it.
Well, first going back to Gary, I'm wondering, okay, so we're seeing Kohberger as a 14, 16-year-old, basically almost on the edge of psychosis. It sounds like, these ranting long posts, full paragraphs, just very difficult to read. Then he goes into drug rehab. So I'm assuming he tried to mute what I would call the demons with drugs. But somehow there's these gaps where he's now pulled himself together and is a PhD. There's these gaps we don't have answers for yet. Like maybe what you said, he did get his brain sealed as he became a young adult, but there's gaps there that I have questions about, especially now the way you've talked about it. How did somebody pull themselves together out of a rehab program? I mean, the man has massive control and willpower because he lost all that weight. He had this really particular diet. So he had control over himself. And when you're talking about having these internal voices and demons and thoughts and mental issues, I think that's specifically exactly what happened with my father. My father knew he had all of this in him. It reached a point where he said he would boil over and then he took it out on these victims. For my father, he was taking out sexual frustrations, but it was also taking out that narcissistic rage and and lack of control, like it builds up and then it has to be displaced so that it's not being displaced back on internally. I think there's so much internally going on with these people that needs to be studied, just like Dr. Kerri was saying, and they don't want to take it out on themselves. So they're taking it out on somebody else, and then they're relieved of that, and then it builds back up. But in regards to women, there's some issues my father says with his mom. I don't know. I never really saw it. He wants to blame some things on his mother. He did have some issues, like he never really had natural relationships with women in high school. There was a period of prostitution when he was in the military, but supposedly a normal relationship with my mom. He mainly murdered women because he said it was easier to control them and they fit more of his fantasy profile. But he had some issues with women, like my mom and me. He didn't like us getting injured, and he liked to control us. He wanted our bodies to be a certain way. He didn't like me being banged up, and didn't like it when I was injured and bleeding and stuff. But my father also was able to have a natural relationship with a woman. So my father, it's different than, say, what I would imagine Kohberger possibly maybe could have been.
Interesting. So I'm back on the regular. So thank you for your patience. Let's see here. Gary, did you already get into the mindset of the situation here? Okay. When I went
the sentence somehow I didn't get it in there was just to say that over the years of working with people who have these kind of loose sub-threshold kind of psychotic symptoms, and when someone is talking about visual perceptual disturbances and faint voices and paranoia and grandiosity, it's kind of hard to see that any way other than somebody a little sub-threshold for that kind of thing, although we don't know because drugs might have been involved at that time. But when you ask people like that, and I have for years, you say to them, why do you think you're having those symptoms? Like, why do you think you're dissociating? When did it start? The person will almost invariably say, if it's trauma, they'll almost invariably say, it started right after the assault I had. It started right after the car accident I had. But what they wouldn't do is blame it on something totally peculiar. People that are more in the psychotic spectrum would say something odd, like, it's because I'm living in a dream, or I'm a person on an operating table somewhere and I'm their ghost. They say weird things like that. And what Kohberger was saying in these posts was that visual snow was the cause of his other symptoms, that there was like something broken in his brain. And by the way, I told you, Kerri, your father wrote in a letter to someone I know that he blamed everything on having had a head injury, which you told me never happened. But Kohberger said that as I understand it, that he thought this visual snow was the cause. And in a very sad way, it looked like he was trying to grope for a community of people online that also had visual snow, that could sort of connect and understand and make sense of this. And whatever happened to him with the drugs and all that, what it looks like is he started to live a very mechanical, rigid, restricted, obsessional existence to glue himself together. And he didn't like that when he got out of control, a little glimpse of this more ill, weird part of himself would show. And then he had to assert dominance to kind of get back to that place of control. You really get a sense that he was like a volcano in that way. And in your father's case, what it sounds like, it was about like masking depression, not so much social awkwardness and all of that, right? You described it that it was depression and being deflated, but something was being masked. But I think the way you want to think about it is, if it were trauma, he would say it started after I got bullied. You know, he wouldn't come up with this weird explanation, right? Now, Chris, are we going to take questions now, or does the group want to?
Yeah, let me throw some questions up here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's one. Do you think it was possible that Bryan saw the girls on social media first, and that's why he chose W? You'd think he'd pick a state without the death penalty. Who wants to take that? Wide open. Dean, you haven't said much.
Well, I don't think we know. You know, the interesting part is the proximity of the two universities, right? To me, that's, and I think, back when you were up there and drove around the area, I think that caught our attention initially. So where he could have seen them, been introduced to them, there's a lot of things that could bring it on to there. But it's always possible that, it is something through social media. But it may not be. I think that's the part that we're kind of all waiting to see how this thing unfolds, to understand. And I think Greg might have mentioned it earlier, but one of the things that hamstrings us a little, in a big way for all of us here is we haven't had access or understanding in detail of the crime scene itself. And so I think there's a lot of information to be gleaned from that, from a behavioral standpoint, that would come to the table, as a result of that.
Okay, and Kerri, here's two questions. One is, how do you think the internet would have played into your father, as well as the second one? This one is, with your insight of what you said, his insecurity by being out on his own. It seemed like his first apartment concept, or the military, etc. It was interesting to hear people report that his father, BK's father, was doing introductions to the neighbors about his son. Like, will you be a friend of my son? And what's the depth of that insecurity there, and if there's any correlation? So the first one is how the internet played, and the second, do you see any similarities between the father introducing his son?
Well, my father would have loved the internet, but my father was very technical challenged. So back in 2005, it was a floppy. Well, they were hard disks. They were the 3x5s, and that's what caught him, because he had used it at the public library and at the church as a president. And he asked through a classified. So he had played what he called cat and mouse games with the police for 3 decades. He had played them in the 70s through the Wichita Eagle, and then started back up in 2004. And he was playing games for almost a year. That's what caught him. He basically led to his own capture by playing these games out of boredom and narcissism, and wanting to relive his crimes, and wanted people to remember him, because people had forgotten about BTK. Like, I didn't know about it till 2004. But with technology, so it was this disc that caught my dad, because he said, can these discs be traced? And of course the police said no. And yes, they could. And they traced it right away to my father, and then verified it with DNA. So my father wasn't very technical literate. I mean, I didn't even have my first computer till college. We had a modem. We still had a landline. I think my parents are probably still using a modem line in 2005. There's been some reports that people thought he was on post boards. I seriously doubt he had the technology. He was still using classifieds. He was using binders, Polaroids, things like that. These dead drop things. So I'm sure in modern age, if my father hadn't been caught, maybe he would have been in trying to mix it up with people. He definitely would have been, trying to find porn and, fixate on people cyberly. But my father's porn was like cutting people out of magazines and stuff that seemed very just normal to us, like, people in fashion magazines. My father cut that stuff out and fixated, and he also fixated with drawing. So there's just a technical difference, technology difference, when you're looking at somebody in a modern age like Kohberger and what he had access to potentially. We don't know if did Kohberger's parents take him out there to WSU, Washington State, over the summer, because for some reason his father flew back to drive him. Now, was that because it was the winter, or was he worried about him? How long was that planned? I mean, did his parents take him out to there over the summer? And was there some sort of introduction there with a father and the neighbor? We really don't know any of that. Or did they just send him out there?
Yeah, no, that is a great point. And that's kind of, I appreciate you bringing that up, because we really don't know if his dad was doing those introductions. It has certainly been floating around, and I think, to your point, I think we should validate that for sure, just to make sure. But if it does become, above the waterline, for lack of a better term, I find that fascinating. That if in fact his father was trying to, create play dates for his son at 28 years old, that is going to be just off the wall. Okay, so let me grab another question here. Question for Kerri. All right. Not to lend credence to the incel phenomenon, but if your father were 25 to 30 now, would he have had difficulty marrying and blending?
It's really hard to compare because you're talking about somebody born in 1945 to a World War II veteran. You're talking about somebody that grew up watching black and white TV and John Wayne was one of his heroes, James Bond kind of stuff, and then being a Vietnam veteran, like on the outside. I mean, you're talking about a completely different era. It's very difficult to stick these big, infamous killers like my father and Bundy and Son of Sam and Kemper. It's all of them that we all know of from the 70s and the 60s. It's almost impossible to stick them in this era because, they would have probably been caught pretty quickly now with surveillance and DNA tech and crime scene tech and all of you brilliant people now. All this stuff was just developing then. There's no way my father would have got away with what he did back then now. So it's very difficult to stick these people in this time period and say, how would they have got along in society? My father just seemed like a very normal Midwestern, above the bar man. He never even had a parking ticket, really. He was the most unsuspecting, normal guy, almost bland, a little bit particular. There was reports after his arrest with his particularities as a compliance officer and annoying some people with measuring their grass and being
measuring
the grass. Yeah, like he would give them a ticket.
Height.
Yeah, and being controlling, of people, the neighbors, and sometimes dogs and would be missing that were supposed to have gone to animal control. Not that my father do side activities with those, probably. But again, going back to what Dr. Gary said earlier, all of these little things, they add up on this side, but you're not going to go from thinking, okay, my father had these particularities or this mood or this anger or even strangulation, to expecting that he's BTK when you don't even know there was a BTK.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Gary, this one's yours. And Ann, you can chime in here. If symptoms are caught at an early age, can the person be treated successfully to keep them from coming to this stage where they take life, and signs to watch for? What are some of the signs to watch? Boy, that's a 2-hour lecture. I know it is, but
we'll give you the short. The problem with the question is that it's unclear what kinds of symptoms you're talking about. For example, are you talking about psychopathy? Are you talking about a person that has a mood disorder, somebody with psychosis? Assuming that this is a follow-up to the point about attenuated psychosis, whether that was here or not. If you were to look at the literature on the relationship between violence and psychosis, what you would see is that actually the relationship is rather overblown in the imagination of people. The truth is that what studies have repeatedly shown is that psychotic people are much more likely to be at risk of being the victims of violence than to actually perpetrate it, unless they are using drugs or alcohol or totally not compliant with treatment and have certain kinds of symptoms like delusions of control or feeling that somebody is out to get them, where they think they're just sort of defending themselves the way that anybody would if there were a real threat coming after them. I was very interested in that point when I was studying attenuated psychosis, and we did several studies, all published, where we were able to establish really for the first time that this window of time between the risk phase for psychotic disorder and first episode is really the time when there is the greatest risk of violence. And the reason is you wouldn't necessarily be medicated. You first have the aha, where you conclude that the things you've been vaguely believing are true and you act on them. And there's a kind of disorganization. We found, for example, that there was an average of about 7 days between the onset of the first episode of psychosis and behaving violently, if you were going to. And so that the person suddenly is overwhelmed with dopamine and, perhaps and energized and angry. Interestingly, in no case in this prospective study of violence we did, where people had these intrusive thoughts of wanting to hurt people, in no case when they ultimately did become psychotic and violent did they act out against the people they had fantasized about. It was always like a stranger or somebody in the wrong place at the wrong time or something. It was like the opposite of what they had fantasized about, because they get kind of disorganized and they thrash out randomly. So now, assuming that's what the person was referring to, what I would say is there are programs popping up all over the world, particularly in Europe, Australia, and United States, to intervene for people with these soft signs. But I think it would be a mistake to think of them as people at very high risk of violence. Where I would worry a lot more is somebody who has the intersection of aberrant personality traits, psychopathic-like kind of features that should go all the way back to childhood, because the antisocial personality disorder has its kind of correlate in youth, right? Conduct disorder goes all the way back to when you're a kid. And you should see, that the intervention would be more like at the level of structuring a person and making them understand that certain behaviors have consequences and all that, but they wouldn't make choices and decisions based on conscience like the rest of us would. And it's very hard to teach someone who doesn't have that moral compass. So that I think when you're talking about intervention there, that is a much more complicated question. The only person I know of who is studying psychopathy across the lifespan from childhood is Dr. Abby Marsh at Georgetown, who is doing even MRIs of children who have psychopathic-like features to watch them over time to see what makes or breaks them going in one direction or the other, and what is going on with their brains from birth or childhood. And, I think there's hope for the future as we come to understand psychopathy as probably at least partially biological. But as it stands, unfortunately, it's more like, what can we do, the rest of us do, to protect ourselves from people who don't have these things under control? Because it would be a fantasy to say that we could control or treat a psychopath and turn them into an ordinary, upstanding citizen. I've never seen anybody do it, and I don't think anybody will anytime soon.
Dr. Burgess, any follow-up on that one?
The only thing I'll add is that anyone that has concern about their child or another person or whatever, or the person themselves is concerned, is to go and see someone. That's what mental health professionals are there to get, an evaluation. My recommendation.
Outstanding. Dean, you've been real quiet over there again, like E.F. Hutton, sitting in the background. What say you?
A big sponge. I'm just a big sponge.
Well, you're like you and I. I mean, Dean and I are investigators. I mean, you notice we're down at the bottom here. And Kerri, I'm going to move you up because you have just taken another spot here tonight. So I'll move you up on the next panel. But absolutely, everybody, Greg, any thoughts from you? And by the way, I've got two more comments here because we've had 2.5 hours of pure information here, and this is a lot to digest. And before I go, so I always give the last. This is kind of a tradition I have over on this panel, Kerri, and you are the newest panel member. So what we do always towards the end is give the newest or the last panel member the closing thoughts for the evening. Okay. So you get to wear that mantle tonight. And when we get ready to leave, what I do is we play a song. We always like to leave in a very positive note here because, you know, more than anything, there are so many of our people in chat that are like yourself. They are survivors, and they have been victims of many challenges in life. So we like to leave them with a very positive feeling. And so what we do is we take them to Hawaii. And I have a really cool song. It's called Hawaii. And it just lifts, in my opinion, everybody up. But there are two comments here. One of them is this one here, from DC. What does the role of power, TA, and scout lead mean? I'm assuming that was back to the scout reference, your father being a scoutmaster or something, but I don't quite understand this question, so forgive me, DC. Does anybody grasp of where this question was going?
Oh, go ahead, Kerri.
It could be, I mean, we know Bryan Kohberger was a teaching assistant. So TA is teaching assistant at Washington State. Scout is probably my father. He was a scout leader with Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts. I mean, if you're talking about leadership, maybe just taking smaller roles of wanting, kind of being in control of your little power center. Like my father liked to control people or control his environment. So he probably kind of got off on controlling these environments. But being a TA is very natural for a PhD student. There's nothing abnormal about that.
You notice I don't have a PhD. My kids do, but I don't have one. So I'm teasing, but I don't. Yeah. So, okay. One more comment here, and I'm going to close statement, and we're going to start with Dean, and we're around the room with Greg, and then Kerri. You will have the final word. Is that acceptable to the panel? Sound good? Okay. So here it is. It says, assuming K&M were sleeping, do you think finding X awake, Xana, would have thrown him off? How about BK acting in his fantasy to play it out? Thank you for a great show. So assuming they were asleep, do you think finding Xana awake threw him off? That's the first question. I think it threw him off. I do. Or intentionally, if the food order lines up potentially with him that evening. I don't know if we've talked about this, guys, but I actually called the Jack in the Box and I spoke to the manager. And I asked him, I said, hey, quick question on your cutoff time for DoorDash. What time is it? He goes, 2:45 a.m. I said, okay, thank you so much. And by the way, how far out can I schedule that? And he says, well, it's on the DoorDash app. You can schedule it anytime you want. We will deliver it because we're 24/7. The only time we're closed is 4 a.m. to 5 a.m. for cleaning. I said, so I could order a DoorDash at 2:45 or 2:44 and schedule it to be delivered at 4 a.m. He says, yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, here's the interesting correlation to that. The phone of Bryan Kohberger goes off the grid at 2:47 a.m. Completely off the grid. He shuts it down. Okay? And remember, we have him passing the house 3 separate times, going into the neighborhood and coming out, going into the neighborhood 3 separate times. But guess what? He comes back a 4th time. The DoorDash is delivered at 4 a.m. They approximately 4 a.m. And at 4:04, his car pulls up and parks, and the homicides are on at that point. So I thought that was a very interesting correlation. Whether it's accurate or not, I don't know. I'm sure the authorities will tell us more about it. But from an investigative perspective, I absolutely thought that was an interesting correlation. So where am I going with this? If the DoorDash delivery, and it was for Xana based on the bag, it had her name on it, and there's a picture of it on the table. If this is the DoorDash delivery for that evening, I find it really interesting that Xana's name was on that bag and that she would have been the recipient of those items. And to find out if, in fact, she potentially could have been an initial target, and everybody's been thinking it's Kaylee, I would submit there may be two, potentially. And so then I was starting to look for correlations on social media, as we call in the business, Kerri, we call it contact points, right? Where based on the victim risk continuum that Greg and everybody and Ann and everybody will talk about, and we've talked about 1,000 times, but what were the contact points, right? Is it social media that was driving this to those contact points? And then does he utilize the tool set of DoorDash to get either A, the door open, or B, get them up so that kind of heightens his throw? That's just what I kind of throw out there on that. So I just answered that first one. How would he act in his fantasy if it played out? And I'll let somebody else answer that piece of the question.
Well, regardless of how well he's planned this out, and the planning is according to his fantasy, things typically don't match our fantasy as we contemplate whatever our goals and aspirations may be. And while we're engaged in that, and it may expect that things are going to play out just right, typically as it relates to human behavior, particularly in this situation of intimate violence, he doesn't know how the victim is going to respond. It's difficult for him to project the response and reaction by those victims under this set of circumstances. He has an idea, he has a hope, an expectation that may help him, in his mind, facilitate the crime. But if it doesn't match that, then he has to adapt to it. And it may completely change and alter what that initial plan was.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very important part. And certainly our study has had many of the killers remarked on that reality does not match the fantasy. And that something always goes wrong. It's never as good as the fantasy. So I certainly think the earlier statement about the knife sheath that was left or found or whatever, that was a mistake that he hadn't counted on, and something happened in that time period, whether the victim hit him or whatever, but he lost track of that sheath. And that was certainly a major error, if you will.
Okay. So just to kind of wrap it up then, first of all, thank you each, all of you, for your amazing insight and for, just always being here and just, it's like, again, it's like a master class. I mean, you could sit, for hours and we could talk for days about the stuff that we're discussing here. It's a very informative evening. I know that the subscribers are extremely excited, and I need to ask, Kerri, would you come back if we ask, and then we'll kind of focus on where you're at and what your research is going on, and talk a little bit deeper into some of your insight. Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, anytime.
Okay, we'd love to have you again, for
Chris,
sure.
If you don't mind, I'd like to Yeah, we can address this maybe later sometime, Kerri, but we'd sure love to have you as one of our expert resources on the Cold Case Foundation.
Yeah, definitely. Just contact me, anything. I'm available for anything. So.
Okay. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, we're so grateful for you. So fantastic show. Dean, you and I were the quiet ones tonight, and which is apropos, but I'm going to give you, your time to say your piece. And then if you wouldn't mind, we'll go to Dr. Burgess, because my mother would never forgive me. And then Dr. Brucato, if you wouldn't mind, we'll go to you next. And then Greg, we'll have you follow Gary, and then Kerri, if you would be kind enough to close this evening, we would be grateful for that. So I'm going to go ahead and be quiet and let you have the last words. Dean, go ahead, start us up.
Well, I'm going to go back where we started tonight. You asked the question, what makes these types of crimes so appealing? And I think I would an analogy of, it's kind of the difference between a plane crash and an automobile accident. The truth of the matter is we're all far more likely to die in a car accident than we are a plane crash. But there's something about plane crashes that just captivate our attention. I think there's three things real quick. One is the fear vulnerability aspect that we have with a plane crash. We don't fly every day. We're not in the middle of it every day. We aren't exposed to it every day. So it's about frequency. But I think it's ultimately about control. There's this mindset that, well, if I'm in a car, I'm in control of where I go. I'm the driver. I can, there's so many different things. Whereas in a plane, we feel like, man, there's just this level of vulnerability and I have no control. And I guess I would just remind everybody, the chances that we're going to have an encounter with a mass killer or serial killer, much lower than a lot of other things that we can do and be involved in. But I just remind us all that when it comes to risk and those types of things, just be situationally aware. Foundation, we teach people all the time, 3 questions, what am I doing? Where am I doing it? And who am I doing it with? And if you answer those questions, and if you don't like the comfort level you have with those, make a change. Go somewhere else. Change who you're with. Change what you're doing. Get to a safe spot, and realize that if we look at this at a 30,000 foot level, the number of people in the world that are dying as a result of serial killers and massacres and that, when they do happen, it's awful. It's a horrible situation, and we have to try to learn from it and work with it. But I think for people, a lot of times they live in fear, and I don't think that's where we want to live either. We educate ourselves, we make the best possible decisions we can, and move forward. It's been a pleasure to be with this panel tonight. Thanks, Chris, for all you do.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess.
Okay, real quick, I learned very early in my career that thoughts drive behaviors, not the other way around. So that we really have to keep pushing for the thoughts that are going on in these particular, in these persons' minds, and try to get to them earlier. I think that was brought up in one of the questions, that we need to find out what they're thinking about so we can intervene. So, and the other, of course, is to keep the victims and their families in mind from this, what is going on. Not only last night, we talked a little bit about the shootings, the mass shootings that are going on in California. And delighted to have Kerri join us. It's great to see you. Thank you for all that you put in to teach us. You really have taught us a lot, and we need to consider the families of the offenders, that they also have their own unique traumatic response. I guess, Gary, you're next.
Well, I just always like to take the opportunity at the end here to just draw everybody's attention to the fact that there are families who lost loved ones because somebody with a certain turn of mind decided to pluck them out of the world, and somebody's friend, significant other, daughter, son, neighbor, coworker, and I really always like to pause and dedicate everything we do to the victims. It's not about the titillation of talking about people who do horrible things. It's all to that end. And Kerri, I think for you to dedicate yourself to helping victims as somebody who was so directly impacted, and then to have people sort of say negative things to you about it and project all kinds of crazy ideas at you about doing it and your motives and all that, it just makes you all the more strong and brave to do it. And and I'm so grateful that we touched base, and then you came on the show and all that, because you just bring an insight and a kind of a grace to this that is extraordinary, and you really help us all understand that when a person commits an atrocious, violent act like this individual is accused of doing, it introduces so much darkness into so many places in the world that it could rock a continent. And we sometimes don't think about all the indirectly affected people, like the parents of the offender who will possibly visit them in prison, or the people who have been shocked to find out a loved one has a dark side, or things like that. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for that, and keep doing what you do. Don't be deterred.
Yeah, thank you. Kerri, I just want to express, in behalf of everybody, again, our appreciation for you being so transparent in a very personal situation, and how we recognize how difficult that is, and how you have now taken something that was intended for evil and are turning it into good. And it's through that whole process, isn't it, that good overshadows evil. Thank you for doing that, and it's great to be part of that effort, as we all are. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
I guess it's left here to me. I just want to really thank the whole panel and Chris and the people watching for giving me a place to talk and hopefully educate and advance a little bit here on somebody like my father. Hopefully it lends to education on somebody like Kohberger. We've got to keep studying and educating and speaking to figure out how to stop these guys before they do what they do, or catch them as soon as we can, like law enforcement has done here with Kohberger. It means a lot to me, because I've been through a good deal of hell to be able to be at this level now, to be able to talk to people that I've admired for a long time, and people that have invested their lives and careers into catching somebody like my father decades ago, like Dr. Ann. So it's really just an immense privilege on my end to be able to be a part of this. And just going forward, I think from a survivor's standpoint, it's really a decision that you have to make day to day. What are you going to do with your life? What are you going to do with what's happened to you? And then try to find some good in it, and just move forward, one step at a time. So you don't have to have all the answers. You just have to keep moving forward, even if it's just moment by moment or hour by hour. So you get up and you fight. Honestly, that's, what you do. So, there's a lot of really horrible, bad, evil stuff in the world. And then there's people that are fighting it, like this panel. And you just keep going forward and try to fend it off with what I call light.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out, 24/7, babe. No timeouts. Wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah. Make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away. You and me go to our favorite place. Feeling the sun on my face in Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. With you, Hawaii. I need a summer breeze, some fresh air to put my mind at ease. No cares. You wanna come with me? Me and you go to our favorite tree. Are you ready now? We jump on a plane now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. Don't hesitate now. We're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. We'll never come down. We're going away. Yeah, we're going away. You and me. Feeling the sun on my face in a while.